Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Friday's edition of Lunch with Your Legislators. Today we have an exciting topic that we're going to discuss, which is being counted in the 2020 census and fair districts. So thank you so very much for joining us. Really quickly, I wanted to go over a couple housekeeping items. We are in presenter mode, so you should only be seeing me speaking right now. If you want your screen to be in presenter mode too, you can click that up in the right-hand corner of your screen. All participants are muted. And if you have any questions, please, if you're on the Zoom call, put those in the Zoom chat. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, please put that in the comments. And we have folks monitoring all of those outlets to bring our lovely presenters those questions. So again, thank you for joining us. I really quickly just wanted to talk about this free COVID-19 testing that is coming down here to Southwest Ohio. The National Guard has been dispersed and is coming to Forest Park next week. So please follow all of your state reps on social media so that you can see those testing locations. There will be 4 total testing locations, absolutely for free and drive-through only here in the city of Forest Park. Those will be held at Word of Deliverance Church, Forest Chapel United Methodist Church, the Walmart here in Forest Park, and then the O'Reilly Auto Parts area / parking lot over on Waycross Road. So again, if you want information on those testing sites, let me know. We'll send those out to you, or follow us on social media. They are there as well. And then I'm going to quickly kick it over to my colleague, Representative Catherine Ingram.
Thanks, Rep Miranda. And here again, thank you all for being here with us today. And when you give those times, make sure the dates are different for each one of those locations. So it's like one on Monday, the other one's on a Tuesday, the other one's on Wednesday. The following week, they will be in North College Hill. And so I forget the name of the church, but if you need to know that, then you can give me a call and we'll make sure we get you that information also, because they'll be in North College Hill the week of the 9th, or do I have my dates wrong? What's today? No, not the 9th. What is it? The 6th. The week of the 6th. I think. Isn't that the Monday, the 6th? The 5th is, the 4th of July is on Saturday, right? So anyway, they'll be in North College Hill that following week, so we can check with that too. Not going to take up too much time, because I think the census pieces is much too important for us to cut off any of the time that they're going to take to talk about that. And I also want to just to note that we are still working very hard with the resolution regarding the declaration that racism is a public health crisis. And so we'll be doing a lot of that as we're continuing the work. I believe that we'll be working with the Ohio FOP and some other folks trying to get some things together. But I want us to recognize that when we talk about as a health crisis, racism as a health crisis, it's something more than just changes in police reform. It's about the economic situation, period, and where African Americans are because of, unfortunately, the trend to have been treated negatively all these years. So talk a little bit more later. Thank you. I'll kick it over to Representative Denson.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now? Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe. As Representative Ingram mentioned, or Representative Miranda mentioned, we're seeing some spikes here in Hamilton County with COVID. And so I'm working very hard to have a testing site show up pretty soon here in the Fighting 33rd House District. It's extremely important that we are paying attention to that and staying on top of it and making sure that we have real numbers so we know where we're at and what we're doing and can effectively communicate to folks how they need to be moving about to stay safe. So that's something that I've been spending a lot of time on. Something else that's extremely important is that racism as a health crisis resolution. I have some exciting things that are going to come out in the form of some legislation that we've been working on. That's going to be pretty good. You'll see that roll out sometime next week. really excited about that because, as she said, it's more than just the health crisis. There are a lot of things that stem off of why we want to declare this the way we're doing it. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll be posting some information on all of those testing sites that'll be coming up soon within the 33rd district to make sure that we're staying on top of everything to keep everyone as safe as possible. I think today's conversation is relevant and important, and I'm looking forward to jumping in because I actually have a couple questions myself. So I will kick it over to Representative Kelly.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for everyone for making the time to be with us today. We're so excited about our Rockstar panel, so I will be very brief. Just wanted to talk about the 3 things that we are getting the most phone calls, emails about in our office, which are the resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis, which my colleagues have already outlined. Just a friendly reminder, we will be doing our town hall on that on July the 10th, so mark your calendars to be with us on July the 10th at 11 a.m. We're still firming up our guests, but we will be welcoming our colleague, Representative Stephanie House, the president of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, as one of our panelists for that day. So you will not want to miss us. One of the other things we're hearing a lot about is voting. And so we're super excited to have our guests here today to talk about how the census impacts districts, which impacts who represents you, and the resources that are available to you. So I'm going to leave that heavy lifting to our guest panelists today as well. The last thing that we are hearing a ton about is still unemployment. We know that folks are still continuing to have challenges with the unemployment system in the state of Ohio. While some folks want to say that we are on the other side of this pandemic, I think, you know, the extra testing sites, the access to testing, and all of the data would show that we are in fact not, and that, you know, the coronavirus is still here, it's still real, and it's still continuing to impact folks. So if you have questions or issues with unemployment, please feel free to contact our office. All of our information is in the chat. And again, thanks so much for the time joining us today. And I will send it back over to Rep. Miranda to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Rep. Kelly. And like we all have said, we have a wonderful program today, so I will waste no more time and get right into introducing Chandra Yungbluth, who is the assistant to the city manager here in Southwest Ohio in the city of Cincinnati. Chandra has a wonderful presentation for us, and we are also joined via phone, I believe, by Phil Lutz, who is the U.S. Census Bureau Deputy Regional Director for the U.S. Census, and Dan Munchbach, hopefully I pronounced that last name right, Dan, who is their partnership coordinator. So Chandra, I will kick it over to you.
Thanks, Rep. Miranda. So I have a question. I have slides. Do they come up, or am I supposed to do that? Or
Yep, you have full control. So go right ahead and share your screen.
Share my screen. Sorry, everybody. I didn't realize that I needed to do this. So actually, if you don't mind, why don't we go ahead and hear while I don't want to take anybody's time while I'm getting my slides up, but why don't we go ahead and hear from the U.S. Census Bureau? I think we've got them on the line. I think that I'm going to go through like a giant overview of what the census is, why it's important to our region, how it impacts us, and why we need to take it, and what we're sort of doing locally to generate some responses on the census. But the U.S. Census Bureau is on the line, and I think that they can talk a little bit about what our response rates look like and what the census timeline is. And also, I think that there are some questions about how we're enumerating very specific audiences like students or people experiencing homelessness. And maybe they can talk for a few minutes about that while I pull up the rest of my slides and then go into the deeper dive about what the census is and why it's important. I apologize. I'm so sorry about that.
That works. That works. So is the state person, Rep. Miranda?
Oh, there we go.
Now we got the slides.
Thanks, Rep. Kelly. So, okay, I can go ahead and begin then. I misread the agenda where it said very clearly that I was going to do this and not you. And so I apologize. That's on me. So Greater Cincinnati Counts is the 2020 Census Complete Count Committee. It's an official designation of the U.S. Census Bureau. And this is a committee that was designated by Mayor John Cranley and Commission President Denise Driehaus to basically get out the count, so to speak, to promote the census and ensure that we get a full and complete count here in Hamilton County and Cincinnati. So we are a more regional complete count committee, and that's why we call ourselves Greater Cincinnati Counts. So that committee comprises of over 200 people representing organizations in the government, faith, nonprofit, industries, some business leaders. We've had a lot of in-kind contributions from Spectrum TV and Cincinnati Bell. We've had great corporate partners as well. And so, like I said, we're here just to make sure that we're getting the count out. So we're going to talk today about what is the census, why is it important, and then how can you, on the call today, be a census advocate. And here's the short and sweet of that is number one, take the census. So next. So we always talk about the census as being three things. It's important, it's easy, and it's safe. And the importance of the census could be many different things to many different people, but the census does three things. It will determine redistricting and reapportionment, which I think the other speaker is going to talk about a little bit more, so I won't go into that. But that is who your representatives are and how you congressional seats are apportioned. Two, it directs federal spending for over 300 programs, about 150 affect Ohio. And this is billions of dollars over 10 years. And then three, the data itself is used in decision-making that goes into everything that government, business, and nonprofit do over the next 10 years. So that data is super important for very different reasons. It's easy to respond. For the first time ever, the US Census is available online. So you can go, if you have a smartphone or computer, or right after this Zoom call, you can go on and take the census at my2020census.gov. Or you can still take it on the phone, and we've got the phone number on the slides too. And then it's safe. So we talk about safety in two different things. Like, even though it is online, your data is not stored online, it's not hackable, it's safe, it's encrypted, it goes into a database that's offline. So you don't have to worry about your data online. The other thing is that there's a lot of confusion around census data, how it's handled, and what can happen with it. So what happens is when the US Census Bureau collects all of this decennial census data, which is essentially just a head count of the nation every 10 years, the US Census Bureau cannot share any personal level detail of that. So the only thing we can see is the amalgamated data for statistical purposes. For 72 years, my name, my address, my age, all those things is held secret. It's only compiled data. And then in 72 years, they will release it. So if you've ever done genealogical research or something like that, you see my grandparents lived at whatever on the census, that's held secret for 72 years. The Census Bureau cannot share that data outside of the Census Bureau for any reason. So Census Bureau employees have to swear an oath saying that they will not share the data, and it's punishable by jail time and thousands of dollars in fines. And that is anywhere from the head of the Census Bureau to the person that knocks the doors. For instance, we at the Complete Count Committee were asking the Census Bureau what we can do to assist the door knockers, and they said nothing, because whether or not a family answers the census or not is private, and we're not even allowed to know that. So they're very, very serious about keeping your data safe. Okay, next. So what is the census? Like I said, next, it's the decennial census, which is what we're talking about this year, is essentially a head count. It's who is here in the United States. And we refer to Census Day. If you want to move to the next slide. We refer to Census Day as April 1st. And April 1st isn't the start of the census or the only day you can take the census. It is the reference point for who lived in the United States or worked in the United States on April 1st. And that's essentially it. It's a head count. It's only 9 or 10 questions. It's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. We've been doing it since 1790. So next. And it's important to note who gets counted. Everybody in the United States, unless you're here on vacation, gets counted. So if you're here on a temporary work assignment, if you're an international student, you get counted. And that's confusing. A lot of people don't realize that if you're only going to be here for like several months, that you do need to be counted, because think about it. You're here, you're using our roads, you're using our public transportation, utilities, schools, all of those things. And we need to know how many people are using those resources. So like I said, you can take it online, by phone, or by mail. And the census is open. It opened on March 12th, and it remains open. It'll probably remain open through October, but we want to make sure that everybody's getting counted right now. The census form is available, and the paper form by now has been mailed to every household in Hamilton County. So if you don't have a paper form in your hand, it's already been mailed to you, and you will need to either take it online, take it by phone, or call the phone number and request a new paper form to be mailed to you. And those paper census forms are available in English or Spanish, and the online form or the phone is available in those 12 additional languages. And then if you don't speak one of those languages, there are video guides and online guides that can walk you through what each thing on the census form says in 59 different languages. So you skip to the next. So because of COVID, there has been a little bit of a shakeup in the census timeline. So the important part of that to note is that the census would have normally closed in July, and would have started door knocking at the end of May. The enumerators, the door knockers, have been pushed back to start on August 11th. And they will probably knock until October 31st. And so we've got a little bit of an extended timeline over the summer, which is great. Next. So here is the website and the phone number to take the census. So again, if you want to take it online, you can take it online. If you want to take it by the phone, take it by the phone. If you need a paper form because you cannot find yours or it lost its way in the mail, call that number and request another paper form if that's how you prefer to do it. And just a point of reference, everybody in Hamilton County was sent automatically the English language form. So if you need a Spanish language form, you can also call and request one in Spanish. Next. Okay, this is the big question. Everybody wants to know what's on the census. And I think when you see what's on the census, it really puts a lot of fears at rest. This data is not very intrusive. It's pretty easy. They want to know how many people are living and staying in your home on April 1st. They want to know if you own or rent, what's your phone number, which they're only going to use to call you to verify some data on your form if they can't read your handwriting or something like that. They'll want to know your name, sex, age and date of birth, whether you are of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. They've been asking that question, number 7, since 1970. They use that data to enforce the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, so it's really important to fill that one out. And then they ask race, whether a person lives or stays somewhere else, and then relationship of each person in the household. So it's, we always say it takes about 10 minutes, and I would say it takes about 10 minutes if you have, a family of like 4 or 5. For me, it took significantly less time. I just whizzed right through it. So it's super easy, and the information is valuable to so many different facets of what we do here for 10 years to come. So next. So why is the census important? Next. In Hamilton County, in 2010, we responded at a 77% rate, which means 23% of our fellow neighbors were not counted. And this is problematic because for every person not counted, we lose $1,814 per person per year in federal funding. So think about it. The federal government has a big pie, and depending on your census count is how big your piece of that pie is. So if everybody's census count gets bigger, it doesn't make the pie bigger. It just makes our share bigger. And so we're competing against a lot of mid-level cities and regions across the country if they're getting better counts. And I'll tell you right now, Michigan is coming in really, really hot on the census. They're doing really, really well. And we're always competing with Michigan. We have a lot of cities and counties that are like sized. And so we're competing with resources with these other places that are getting counted at a higher rate. So the reason we know that it's 77%, and I will tell you the city of Cincinnati was at 70%, the reason we know that is because the city and county have to share early on in the process every residential address with the U.S. Census Bureau. So what the U.S. Census Bureau is saying is that what they're getting back is 77% of those residential addresses have been counted. So next slide. So this is just a breakdown of that federal funding and what it means over 10 years. So our region is losing $3.4 billion over 10 years for all those people that are not getting counted. And that's a big deal, especially if we're talking about economic recovery, unemployment, our schools, our healthcare, all those things, first responders, all those things are dictated by census information and dollars. And so our programs that are allotted by census counts. So that's a lot. That's not nothing. Next. And here's just a sampling of some of the programs that that money would come to, and that's housing for elderly, WIC programs, temporary assistance for needy families, highway construction. We're talking about lead remediation, which is a very, very big thing in a city like ours with old housing stock, and then Medicare, Medicaid, first responder grants, things like that that are really important. SNAP funding, school lunches, all those. Census data informs the allotments that we get for those. Next. So, you know, I've got a couple of slides here about the census in the context of what's happening in the world today. I think it's really important that we know the census helps plan funding for hospitals, clinics, and emergency services. It informs public health officials who's at risk. We know that people of certain age groups are at risk more than others, and we need to know how many of those members are in our community. It allows first responders to identify resources that we need to protect our community. So when you're talking about how much PPE you need or other things like that, you need to know who's in your community and how to protect them. And then it directs investments that contribute to a strong community and economy that will assist in recovery. We talked a lot about those programs and things that people are going to be relying on throughout the recovery. So when you're talking about, you know, the pandemic world, census data is very important to make sure that we're prepared, we're reacting appropriately, and then we're able to recover. So next. And then we're talking a lot today about building power and political change and things like that. And these talking points are from The Color of Change. And I really like this messaging. I think it's really great. We talk about building power, but if you're not counted and you're not seen, how can you build that power? So making sure that, you know, we can all put our hand up and say, we're here. You absolutely cannot ignore the data and the numbers of who's around and who exists in your community. And also remember just directing that funding like healthcare, food, and housing. And then making sure that, like I said, that data is used to enforce Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And then Katy's going to talk more about the democracy piece of it, voting and representation. So, next. So here's sort of like the lay of the land about how Hamilton County comes in. So this is a map of the county, and the darker the color, the lower the responses. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the actual neighborhoods and sort of where they where they measure up, and here are our hardest to count areas in the city and in the county. And it's just a snapshot. We don't need to dwell on that. I'll go ahead and click through. And then who is hard to count? So young children, we estimate that we could have missed between 1 and 2 million young children, specifically children under 5, I think it is, in the last census. So there's a big effort to make sure that we're counting children this time around. I think it's because, you know, in America, we have changing family dynamics. So oftentimes we have parents who are sharing custody and maybe thought one parent was counting the child and the other wasn't. We have multi-generational families where more aunts, grandparents, etc., are taking care of children that aren't like their direct son or daughter, and so aren't maybe accounting for counting those kids. And also hard to count are highly mobile people, racial and ethnic minorities, non-English speakers, low-income persons, people experiencing homelessness, undocumented immigrants, LGBTQ persons, people with mental or physical disabilities, and then people who do not live in traditional housing. So thinking like couch surfer or granny pod or somebody that lives in somebody's basement or something like that. So next. We talked about the census being safe, so we can move through that. It is just, we always reiterate about the safety of the census. The U.S. Census Bureau cannot share the data with any other federal, state, or local entity. So your landlord will not know if you have more people on your census than maybe on your lease. Nobody's going to know that, so count everybody in the household. Taking the census and counting for who's living in your household is not going to affect your state benefits. The information cannot be shared with ICE or immigration or any other law enforcement agency. So we just want to make sure that we are getting a complete and accurate count. We want to make sure that we're getting all the federal funding distribution that we know is due to us. We want to make sure that we have fair and accurate political representation. And also, we know that Cincinnati and Hamilton County are probably growing the fastest in the state, if not in the entire Midwest. And we want to show that. We want to show that for bragging rights. We know that that is what attracts businesses and development and things that continue to grow the prosperity of our region. Next. So how can you be a census advocate? Next. Well, easy, take the census, but also Greater Cincinnati Counts, we regularly put out messaging and things like that on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. So certainly follow us and share that information out. We tend to work with some of our national census advocacy partners around messaging that is appropriate to different message themes. So we're doing a lot of pride messaging this month, and how the census particularly is important for people in the LGBTQ community. So if you want like the most relevant, up-to-date things happening around the census or why it's important or updates on the timeline, then definitely do follow us. We have really, really great resources at greatercincinnaticounts.com. We have an entire resource library there to help promote the census or get information about the census, and we've made it open to the public. It's not behind a password or anything like that, just for the committee. We wanted to make sure that everybody who wanted to see that stuff had access to it. So next. And the census is open, so take the census.
Okay, so with that, Chandra, I wasn't sure if your guests wanted to weigh in or give any brief comments, or just wait until the Q&A, and then maybe we can go ahead and have Katy do her presentation about how the census is going to impact redistricting. So maybe let's just have Katy go ahead with that. And
hi, everyone. Thank you, Rep. Kelly, for the invitation to join all of you, and thank you to Chandra for that good overview of the census. She took a lot of my talking points, so I'm going to cut some of mine and speed through this so that we have enough time for questions. My name is Katy Shanahan. I'm the Ohio State Director for All on the Line, and in case you're not familiar with our organization, we are a grassroots advocacy campaign that is part of a national effort to end gerrymandering. Our goal is to bring people people together across every issue that's on the line this year to win on redistricting next year in 2021. And we hope to not only raise the awareness about the harmful impacts that gerrymandering has on the issues that we care about and on the communities where we live, but to also engage people in every step of the redistricting process. And I always talk about how the census is actually our first crucial step in getting fair maps for Ohio in 2021. So it's a really great opportunity to dovetail off of Chandra's presentation about the census to talk about the next major thing that happens that also has a decade's worth of impact on our communities, and that is the redistricting process. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about what gerrymandering actually looks like in Ohio. I'm sure that anybody who's tuned into this call probably knows that Ohio is unfortunately home to some of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. And when we talk about gerrymandering, we mean when district lines are skewed to exaggerate political power for one party over the other, not because they're winning that many votes against their opponents, but because they are cheating by drawing lines that benefit their party over somebody else. And the result is that voters lose their voice in the political process, which obviously is not how a representative democracy is supposed to work. But I love showing this next slide because it visually packs a good punch in terms of really showing what gerrymandering looks like in Ohio. So unfortunately for Ohioans, for the last decade, our votes have not actually equaled political representation, both in our congressional delegation, who we send to DC, but also in our state legislative chambers. So both of these sets of pie charts show 2018 election results. On the left-hand side, you see that Democrats and Republican candidates overall throughout the state are picking up about a 50-50 split in terms of the votes that they're capturing, and yet our Republican U.S. House representatives take 75% of the seats. So there's a huge skew in how many seats they're getting versus how many votes they're actually winning at the ballot box. And you see the same thing at the state legislative level, which I'm sure all the representatives could talk to you at great lengths about at the state level. But even though, again, we're splitting votes between Democratic and Republican candidates all totaled together across the state, nearly 50-50 down the middle. Yes, we are actually a purple state, I promise. We're just a red gerrymandered state. So even though Republicans are not winning this at the ballot box, they hold super majorities of the seats in both the state House and the state Senate. And that, like I said, it's a form of cheating, right? You are gaining more seats than you are actually winning votes at the ballot box. And so when we talk about what is on the line, when we're talking about redistricting, we're talking about our ability to affect positive change on any political issue that matters to us. It doesn't matter what issue brings you to the political table. It is inherently impacted by gerrymandering. So no matter if the person who is representing you either down here in Columbus in the State House or in DC matches your political opinions about any number of issues, because of how skewed our lines are, it means that there is an imbalance in power in terms of taking the political voice away from the voters, because we know long before election day who's most likely to win those seats because of how the lines were drawn. And the impact lasts well beyond election day. So it's not just about denying voters the opportunity to elect representatives of their choosing. It also impacts what those elected officials actually do when they're in office, because when you have gerrymandered districts, it means that your elected officials are manipulating the map drawing process. So they are choosing their voters, not the other way around like it should be. And so when they're in office, they're not actually accountable to all of us as their constituents. They're accountable in large part in primaries. That's really a lot of the only competition that we see in our districts. And they're also usually accountable in a much larger way to the people who are making big campaign contributions, right? And so our inability to make any sort of progress on addressing racism as a public health crisis, or in providing access to affordable and non-discriminatory healthcare, or in reducing gun violence, or in making sure that our election this fall is safe and secure and accessible for all voters. we're not able to make progress on those issues, not because Ohioans don't actually support those issues, but because our legislators, who in large part do not actually represent all of Ohio, don't support those issues. And so that's what we see when we have such gerrymandered maps. So maybe you're wondering why I'm talking about the redistricting process, which doesn't actually start in earnest until the late summer of 2021, which at this point seems like it's a century in the future. But there are actually a lot of opportunities in 2020 for us to maximize, to be able to set us up for success next year to get fair maps through the redistricting process. And the first one should not surprise you, given the first presentation today. The first thing we can do is get a complete count on the 2020 census. The reason I say that is because the census, like Chandra just laid out, is a head count of every single person who lives in this country that happens every 10 years. And then after that head count is done on a nationwide level, every single state is then required to go through a process called redistricting. And the redistricting process is simply redrawing district lines to account for where populations have shifted in the last decade, to take note of where your neighbors have moved. If the demographics in a certain community have shifted over the last 10 years, we want to make sure that we are accurately capturing that so that we can draw lines to uphold the constitutional promise of one person, one vote. And that means that all of us are equally and proportionally politically represented, both in our state legislature, but also in the US House of Representatives. So the other piece of information that we get from the census is how many congressional seats every state gets. So Ohio now has 16. We are likely to lose one of those congressional seats, not because we've lost population over the last 10 years. We've actually gained population. It's just we're growing at a little bit of a slower pace than some other states like Texas and Arizona and Florida. So those other states are going to get a bump up in seats, and Ohio will unfortunately go from 16 to 15 congressional seats. But it's still really crucial that we get a complete count on the census so that we are ensuring that we can actually draw good, fair maps next year. The other reason why the census is so important is to talk about how the census and redistricting interact with each other. So like I said, first comes the census. It's our once-in-a-decade opportunity to help shape the future of our communities. And the key thing to remember about the census is it's really about two things. It's about money power and it's about political power. Making sure that every single person in your community is counted means that your community is getting all of the resources that it needs so that you and your neighbors can lead healthy, stable lives. And it's also about making sure that your community gets the political representation and power that it deserves. So first comes the census. You got to make sure that everybody is counted. Every single 10 years, the federal government has to conduct a census. And then once the census is done, every state has to go through the redistricting process, which again is just redrawing lines to account for where that population has shifted over the last 10 years. The thing that is not required is the gerrymandering part. That is not something that we have to do. It's not something that we should do. We should redraw those lines so that we are adequately affording every single Ohioan the political representation that we deserve, both in our state legislative districts and also in our congressional districts. So I did just want to very quickly highlight that the census, like Chandra talked about, a couple months ago, the Census Bureau announced that they wanted to have a 4-month delay in their operations because of COVID-19 and needing to pause when enumerators, who are the folks who come around and knock door to door to make sure that you've filled out your census if you haven't yet, needing to pause them coming out into the field to do that until it's safe. And that has repercussions on the redistricting process because we don't get, as states, we don't get information about not only how many US House seats we get, but also in the redistricting state-based data, that is the bulk of the data that's used to actually redraw the lines until after all of the census data has been compiled. And so if all of that's getting delayed by 4 months, it also means that our redistricting process is getting a huge crunch in how quickly we have to turn around and redraw all of our maps. And you may remember that in the last few years, Ohioans completely overhauled how we will go through the redistricting process with some really important reform measures that passed in 2015 and in 2018. And so we will be working on a brand new set of rules for how redistricting will actually happen, but also a brand new set of criteria that the maps have to meet. And those will be really important to ensure that we get fair maps. But the other thing that those reforms included were deadlines for when those maps have to be drawn. And the 4-month delay will make that deadline really difficult to meet, because we're going to have a lot less time for the redistricting commissioners and legislators to redraw those maps. And so I wanted to just very quickly lift up a piece of legislation that's actually in the US Senate. It's the HEROES Act. It already passed the US House. And there are a ton of other things in the HEROES Act that I'm not going to cover because it's not directly relevant to the census or the election. So I'm only going to focus on a part of what's in the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act is the second major stimulus package that the US House passed, I want to say about 3 weeks ago now. And included in this bill are a number of necessary funding provisions to help make sure that we secure the integrity of the election this fall, of the 2020 census, and of the redistricting process next year in 2021. So I am here to urge you to call your US senators today to urge them to pass the HEROES Act. Included in here are provisions that would support the US Postal Service. If we do not have a well-funded postal service, there is no way that we can have a robust vote-by-mail system, which is going to be really important this fall when it still likely will not be safe for us to be in big crowds, and we want to try to avoid long lines and folks standing in crowds at polling places. It also includes a lot of crucial funding to go to county boards of elections so that they can administer a safe and accessible election, to help pay for things like prepaid postage so that we're not forcing voters to pay to vote by mail, which is currently what we're going to do in Ohio this fall if we don't get the funding to cover it. But to also implement a lot of important provisions that would help make this election safe and accessible, but will also help make sure the census can be administered to cover some of the costs that the Census Bureau has incurred because of COVID-19. So if you go to ontheline.org/HEROES Act, you can either click to email or call your US senators, either Senator Portman or Senator Brown, to urge them to pass the HEROES Act. It's really important that we get action on this so that we have a safe and accessible election this fall, so that you can go vote for all your Fair Maps advocates who are running for office. Also, I'm going to do yet another plug. If you have not yet, to go to my2020census.gov to fill out your census. It is so important for all of us to be counted. You want to harness the political power that your community deserves. We cannot wait another 10 years to get fair maps. This is our opportunity to do that this year. So fill out your census, text 5 of your friends, make sure they have also filled out the census, go vote this November, and then come join our fight next year in 2021 to get fair maps. If you want to join us, you can go to allontheline.org. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over. I know that was very speedy, but I want to be cognizant of time. So thank you again, Rep. Kelly, for the invitation. Happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thanks so much, Katy and Chandra. We really appreciate both of you being here. This is very important and very timely. And we are going to have one more surprise guest offer some brief comments because she's with us from the National Census Office, and that is Erin Peabody. Normally we like to allow a lot of time for questions, but this is really important information that is going to impact our lives for the next 10 years. So we can spare a few extra minutes, I think, to hear from Erin Peabody from the National Census Office. And I think you're unmuted, Erin, whenever you want to speak. Or not, we'll go to a few questions, and then Erin, if you want to talk, just give me a message in the chat or give Chandra a text, and we'll put you back on here. So we have talked a lot about, the next 10 years, the next 10 years, the next 10 years. So what happens if somebody doesn't fill out their census, or if a year from now we find out that a certain community is really undercounted, and we say, okay, this is a huge problem, we really missed the boat. What can we do about this? So, Chan, Katy, If we miss the boat on the census, then what do we do in years 1 through 9?
Well, I think like first and foremost, like this is our chance to get it right. So let's get it right the first time. So everybody needs to take the census. Like Katy said, text 5 of your friends and get them to take the census. Make sure that if you live with a bunch of roommates, that you're all getting counted on the census, things like that. Make sure that if you work at an organization, that maybe your employer can send out information about the census and just encourage people to do it. This is the decennial census. The U.S. Census Bureau does many different census questionnaires over the next 10 years, but they use the decennial census as the baseline. So if we get it wrong, every other questionnaire that comes out, which they do, the American Community Survey, which used to be called the long form every 10 years. So some people would know that. And I see Phil's iPhone, and this might be Phil from the census who can talk a little bit about that as well. But I mean, the decennial census is the baseline for all the data that gets collected over the next 10 years. So we do need to get it right. Phil?
I think that Rep. Miranda may need to unmute Phil from the pilot's seat there. We're having a hard time getting your folks from the big house in here, Chan.
Well, I'll pipe up to say what happens if we don't get a complete count, just to boost what Chandra was saying. If you think about, and this is actually a story that I stole from Rose, who also works with the U.S. Census Bureau in the Philly office. She always talks about, if you imagine a 4-year-old girl who's 4 years old in 2020, and we don't count her in the 2020 census. The next time that we have a chance to count her on the census is after she's gone through all of her elementary school, all of her middle school, and the start of her high school. And it's not that her needs or her family's needs or her community's needs have changed in those 10 years. It's just, it means that we miss the opportunity to have her voice counted and represented when funding decisions are being made on her behalf, on her community's behalf, in DC and in the state legislature. And so when you're thinking about the difference between when you were 4 years old and when you were 14 years old, that's a huge gap. And yes, the ACS, the annual survey that the census does, helps sort of fill those gaps, but the real shot is in getting the decennial census right on the first try, because in terms of redistricting, we don't get an annual retry to redraw those districts. We get a once-in-a-decade shot. Hopefully, if we get bipartisan passed maps, that will last the whole decade. We don't get a redo every year to help fix where we've undercounted communities. So it's not just about the financial resources that come into your communities, although those are obviously incredibly important, but it also means robbing your community of the political power that it deserves for 10 years. And there's little that we can do until 2030 to correct that if we don't get it right in 2020.
Phil, I think we've got you hooked up now if you want to offer a few comments on that.
So can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay. So actually, there's not much more to add. The speakers have already covered most of it. I just want to make sure everybody is aware that it is the census of population and housing. And when you're looking at some of those response rates that we looked at earlier, that's the number of households that have responded. There's areas of Cincinnati and Hamilton County with a lot of growth right now. You see construction going on. We have some of those addresses in our address list, and they're part of the response rate, but there's no one living there. So those households aren't going to respond. What I want to make clear is that when we start knocking on the doors of households that haven't responded, we will be knocking on all those doors. And what we found in our tests is when we leave, if someone's not home and we leave a notice of visit, they still have an opportunity. They have instructions to call a toll-free number or go online, and we find that many of them will do that. The other item that we're about to begin is our group quarters enumeration, which it counts people that are living in long-term care facilities and other non-housing situations. So that's about to begin. And as has already been said, we're going to continue following up with people and households through August, September, even October, if necessary, to get every household accounted for.
And actually, Phil, your comments lead into a question that we had from one of the folks who's joined us today for this town hall, which is that he represents a church that has no one living on the property. And while completing the online census form, the system can't accept that no one lives here as an answer. So what's the pathway forward for that?
Yeah, so that's actually going to be a situation where one of our enumerators this summer will actually come and visit to verify that there's no one there, and that's how we will account for it.
Okay, that's great. That's really, really helpful. Our next question is going to be probably a little bit more for Katy, and it's related to gerrymandering. So I think that most, if not all, of the representatives on this call have had many a conversation about how folks are represented. We know that neighborhoods are split into. We know that there are folks on both sides of the aisle who don't feel like their interests are being served. So, you know, there are some people who would say that gerrymandering is a very partisan issue. But I would say that gerrymandering is the most nonpartisan issue because having fair maps is good for everyone. So I don't know, Katy, if you want to weigh in on that.
Sure. So I would agree with you. To me, gerrymandering is the root cause of our broken political system. It equally harms Democrats, Republicans, people who are independent, Green Party members. Doesn't matter what label you have in the political space. And the reason for that is because our democracy should rest on the power of the people. We should have districts that are not only representative of Ohio's voters, but that are also responsive to Ohio's voters. It's not just about having the ability to elect representatives of your choosing, but to also have the power to hold them accountable once they've been elected if they're not living up to how you feel as a voter, if you're not feeling well represented in office. And that's something that people can relate to no matter what side of the aisle they're on, right? There are, that the legislature has yet to pass universal background checks, right? Even though that's a policy that 90% of Ohioans agree on, is a direct result of gerrymandering. 90% of Ohioans includes people of all political stripes. I don't know how many other issues you can find where there's 90% consensus across the board. And that's a perfect example, right? And the reason it hasn't moved obviously isn't because voters don't actually support it. And if 90% of Ohioans support an issue, 90% of our legislators should also support that issue if they actually represented their voters. The reality, though, is that when you have gerrymandered maps, your legislators don't actually represent you as the voter. They are there representing the fringes of their parties on either side. This is true, right? Because a lot of the times it's not just about the difference in how many votes Republicans or Democrats are getting versus how many seats they get. It's also about how uncompetitive our districts are in Ohio. So like I said, there's almost no competitive seats in the entire state, not only for our state legislative map, but also for our congressional map. Republicans have held 12 of the 16 congressional seats for the entire decade, even though for the entire decade we have been a purple state. And that means that the only competition that most legislators will ever see is during their primary, which forces legislators to go to the extremes, to pick up the people who always come out in those primaries. And that means there's a whole bunch of people in the middle, no matter where you land on the political spectrum, who aren't being well represented. So I absolutely agree, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. What we are fighting for, I always say I'm not being hyperbolic here, what we are in the fight for is the fate of our democracy, because what we are saying is that we want to restore power to the people where it should be. We want to have districts that not only result in us being able to elect legislators who actually represent us, but we also want to be able to hold them accountable. And the only way that we can do that is by getting fair maps.
I do have a question. This may go to Chandra or whomever from the team. I know that with the complete count committees and making sure that everybody's participating, we're finding good ways to get a good turnout. There also comes that component of the hard to count areas. And one of the things I always say is that when we have folks even on the ground, when it comes to door knocking and interacting, it's always good to have people who are working in those communities that they are familiar with, a familiar face and trust. And I've been working with Bobby Wilson and Crystal Davis here on the recruitment side of things. Are there still opportunities for recruiting for folks to come on board, to be hired, to do some of that work, particularly in those hard to count areas as we start to see the numbers and it can direct them in the right direction? What is that process looking like? Because I really think that's important, that familiar faces are on the ground as we try to make sure that we're coming up on the deadline, we're getting as most as we can out of this.
Yeah, I'll take a quick shot at Bill, but I will say that the U.S. Census Bureau has worked with the city, different people on the ground, to make sure that their recruiters is from the neighborhood as locally as possible. And due to COVID, they had locally, I think, recruited all the people that they needed, but now they're ramping back up again and doing more recruitment. So I think Phil can talk in more detail about that.
Yeah, it's still just asking people to go to 2020 census/jobs and put in their application. We are making our selections as we speak to have people from the neighborhoods be the ones who knock on the doors of their neighbors. As you said, it's a trusted face that will be going there. Representative Denson, would like to also thank you for efforts you've been doing to work with our staff and let people in your district know about the job opportunities and continue to encourage people to apply.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that.
I just have this is Rep. Ingram. I just have a couple of questions, actually. My first one is, how do I know I definitely didn't get counted?
So
okay, that's cool. We'll figure that out sooner or later, because my problem with that is that unless you come and knock on my door, I happen not to be there, you leave me something on my door, I don't know that I didn't get counted. I may have mailed in that little form that they sent. And so
Correct.
That becomes an issue too when people don't know that they've already been counted. Thank you for your census. We're good. They do it when you do it online, but there's no other way that happens. So we need to figure out how that happens, how we know that people have already been counted. And then I have a question regarding prisoners and how they are counted in those institutions.
So this is Phil. I can take that one. Actually, both of those. So remember what I said earlier. This is the census of population and housing. So in order to have a questionnaire go to your address, we have to know the address and the location of your housing unit. So every form that is delivered has a code on it that identifies your address. So if we get an answer back from a household, then we know you've been counted, and you can actually go online and enter your information again. We have what's called an unduplication effort on the back end, so that if we do get two responses from the same address, we unduplicate it so that each person's only counted once. As to the prisoners, that's part of our institutional and group quarters population. We use a process called usual place of residence, of where we count people. So we do count people where you usually live and sleep most of the time. So college students are counted at their dorms, or if they're living off campus where they are living. Prisoners are counted at the prison for the purposes of the final U.S. Census counts. There have been some states that have made an effort to, after we've delivered the counts, to do some administrative reallocation of prisoners based upon where the home location where they were living before they were incarcerated. That's a state issue, not a federal issue. But some states are using that as part of their redistricting data.
Well, I just want to make sure I put that out there because that becomes an issue, which is why you have a Warren County with the population that it does. And then you've got some other institutions that don't. And if that person's not incarcerated for those whole 10 years, then they're back somewhere else that they have not received their fair share for.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, with the redistricting process, Ohio has traditionally counted people who are imprisoned where they are imprisoned and not at a last known address or where they're actually from. So that also then skews population numbers for the redistricting process, because most of our jails and prisons mostly tend to be in rural counties that have lower populations of people who are not imprisoned, right? And particularly given who tends to make up the prison population in terms of demographics, that skews, over counting Black and brown populations, right, in rural conservative districts or counties rather. And so then that also skews how lines are drawn. So I would actually argue that there's nothing in the Ohio Constitution that forbids legislators from not doing that and from drawing district populations that actually account for people who are in prison for maybe a last known address. I know states like Colorado, for example, recently just passed a prison gerrymandering bill that would count people where they actually had a last known address or where they're from, rather than counting them where they're imprisoned in institutions, to help unskew that.
It only makes sense. It only makes sense because if they're not there the whole 10 years, then that community that they come back to is not served.
Right. Yep.
So we'll have to look at that one.
Yeah, I'll also add, you said that if somebody comes to your door, how do you know that you didn't fill it out? If you've already filled it out, nobody will come to your door. And we find a big incentive for a lot of people to go ahead and call in their census data or go online and fill out their census data, because if they do that, then nobody will knock on your door. The U.S. Census Bureau knows who's filled it out and who hasn't, so they won't knock on doors.
Now, I get that. The person doesn't know, though, that they've been counted. We don't ever tell them we've got you.
Correct. Yeah.
Because the information is not available anywhere. You can't share it with anybody. So I will not know that I've been counted until 72 years from now. And I promise you, I'll be well dead.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty like, I think there's probably a lot of people that feel like they are worried about when their absentee request ballot goes in, so they always double check and make sure, and that there isn't this sort of mechanism here. And I get where you're coming from. A lot of people like to make sure.
So if I can add one other item to that, in some cases where we are not able, after multiple attempts, to find someone from that household home to answer the questions. In some cases, we can use what's called administrative records. We may already have some information from other federal sources about the occupants of that household through Medicare or Social Security or other programs. We're also allowed to talk with like a building manager or other knowledgeable person, a neighbor, who can provide basic information about the residents of a household. It's what we call last resort information, but again, it's a basic attempt to make sure that we're counting everybody.
And with that, Phil gets the last word. We apologize for going a little bit over, but obviously there is a lot to talk. There's a huge impact. You can fill out your census at my2020census.gov, or you can visit greatercincinnaticounts.com. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists, Chandra Yungbluth, Assistant to the City Manager from the City of Cincinnati, Katy Shanahan, State Director for All on the Line, Ohio, as well as our friends that joined us from the Census Bureau. I say there's a good chance that we will have them back to talk some more about this, because we could talk about this for a long time. So on behalf of Reps Miranda, Denson, Ingram, and myself, we want to say thank you again so much for joining us. We are going to take next week off on July 3rd, but we're going to be back on July 10th. You're not going to want to miss it. Racism is a public health crisis. Representative Stephanie House from the Black Caucus, Renee Mahaffey-Harris from Closing the Health Gap. We've got a ton of important things to talk about. So we will put out the link so you can register, send us your questions. Since we're not getting a hearing in the House, you want to send us some testimony, talk about why you think it's important. We would love to have that too. So thanks again to everybody for joining. My2020census.gov. Fill it out today. It only took me 2 minutes. It'll take you less than 10 minutes. My2020census.gov.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
You all have a safe weekend.